In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where power whispered its secrets through stone walls worn smooth by centuries of ambition, there lived a truth that few dared to acknowledge. It was a truth born not from the naive optimism of philosophers, but from the cold observation of human nature in its rawest form. This truth belonged to Niccolò Machiavelli, a man who understood that the greatest battle any leader faces is not against external enemies, but against the weakness that dwells within. The year was 1513, and Florence trembled under the weight of foreign occupation. In a modest villa outside the city, a disgraced diplomat sat at his wooden desk, his fingers stained with ink, his mind churning with the lessons of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. Machiavelli had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the collapse of republics, and the birth of new orders from the ashes of the old. Through it all, one pattern emerged with crystalline clarity: those who mastered themselves mastered the world, those who remained slaves to their own nature became slaves to others. The document that would emerge from those contemplative months would not merely be another treatise on governance. It would be a manual for transformation, a guide for those brave enough to destroy the weak aspects of their nature in order to forge something harder, more resilient, and ultimately invincible. For Machiavelli understood what few before him had dared to articulate: that true power comes not from controlling others, but from achieving such complete mastery over oneself that external control becomes impossible. This paradox, that by detaching from the emotional investments of the game, one gains the ability to control the entire board, would become the cornerstone of a philosophy that transcended mere political maneuvering. It was a philosophy of conscious evolution, of deliberate self-destruction in service of a greater reconstruction. The weak self, with its fears, its desperate need for validation, its emotional reactivity, and its attachment to temporary outcomes, had to die so that something far more powerful could take its place. Part 1: The Anatomy of Weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Florence as Lorenzo de' Medici made his way through the Oltrarno district, his mind heavy with the weight of recent betrayals. He had trusted advisors who sold his secrets to rival families, believed in alliances that crumbled at the first sign of pressure, and invested his emotional well-being in outcomes he could not control. As he paused before the statue of his ancestor, Cosimo the Elder, Lorenzo began to understand what the old man's weathered features had always tried to tell him: power is an illusion until you stop needing it. The weakness that destroys leaders is rarely obvious. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or dramatic displays of incompetence. Instead, it operates in the shadows of the psyche, manifesting as subtle dependencies that gradually erode one's foundation of strength. Machiavelli, observing from his exile, had identified these patterns with surgical precision. The weak self reveals itself through its attachments to approval, to specific outcomes, to the comfort of familiar strategies, and to the dangerous luxury of emotional investment in temporary circumstances. Consider the merchant prince who built his empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking, only to lose everything because he could not bear to cut ties with a business partner who had become a liability. His attachment to personal relationships, while admirable in its loyalty, became the very mechanism of his destruction. The weak self clings to what feels comfortable, even when comfort becomes the enemy of survival. Or examine the case of the military commander who achieved brilliant victories through innovative tactics, yet found himself outmaneuvered by lesser opponents because he had become emotionally invested in maintaining his reputation for never retreating. His need for others to see him as invincible made him predictable, and predictability in warfare is death. The weak self seeks validation from external sources, making itself vulnerable to manipulation by anyone clever enough to understand its dependencies. The anatomy of weakness extends beyond individual psychology into the realm of strategic thinking. The weak self approaches challenges with reactive patterns that have worked in the past, failing to recognize that each new situation requires fresh analysis unburdened by emotional investment in previous successes. It seeks to control outcomes directly, through force or manipulation, rather than understanding that true control comes from positioning oneself where any outcome serves one's larger purpose. In the merchant quarters of Florence, a young banker named Giovanni had learned this lesson through painful experience. His early years in commerce had been marked by tremendous anxiety over each transaction, each negotiation fraught with personal significance. He would lose sleep over deals that represented a tiny fraction of his portfolio, simply because his sense of self-worth had become entangled with his professional success. The breakthrough came when he realized that his emotional attachment to outcomes was actually impairing his judgment, causing him to make decisions based on fear rather than strategic advantage. The transformation began with a simple exercise in detachment. Instead of viewing each business deal as a reflection of his personal worth, Giovanni learned to see them as moves in a larger game where his true objective was not winning individual transactions, but positioning himself for long-term dominance in the market. This shift in perspective, from personal investment to strategic positioning, freed him to make decisions based purely on what would serve his larger goals, regardless of how they might affect his ego in the short term. The process of identifying weakness within oneself requires brutal honesty about one's motivations and reactions. Most people live their entire lives without ever examining why they make the choices they make, content to follow patterns established in childhood or imposed by social conditioning. The strong self, however, emerges from a willingness to question everything, every assumption, every emotional reaction, every strategic impulse, and to rebuild one's approach to power from the ground up. Machiavelli observed that the princes who survived the chaos of Renaissance Italy were not necessarily the most intelligent or the most virtuous, but rather those who had achieved the greatest degree of emotional independence from their circumstances. They could adapt to changing situations without being paralyzed by attachment to how things used to be or anxiety about how things might become. Their strength lay not in their ability to impose their will on events, but in their capacity to remain fluid and responsive while others rigidly defended positions that had outlived their usefulness. The weak self manifests in countless ways: the leader who cannot delegate because they need to feel indispensable, the strategist who cannot change course because they have publicly committed to a particular approach, the negotiator who cannot walk away from a bad deal because they have invested too much time and ego in reaching an agreement. Each of these patterns represents a form of slavery to one's own psychological needs rather than commitment to optimal outcomes. Breaking free from these patterns requires what Machiavelli termed the discipline of detachment, a systematic practice of separating one's identity from one's circumstances, one's worth from one's achievements, and one's peace of mind from one's ability to control external events. This detachment is not indifference or apathy, but rather a form of strategic clarity that allows one to see situations as they truly are, rather than through the distorting lens of personal investment. The merchant Giovanni discovered that as he became less emotionally invested in individual outcomes, his actual performance improved dramatically. Without the paralysis of fear or the distortion of ego, he could see market trends more clearly, assess risks more accurately, and make decisions more quickly. His detachment from short-term results paradoxically led to better long-term results, as he was free to make moves that might look foolish in the moment but served his larger strategic objectives. This principle extends far beyond commerce into every arena of human endeavor. The politician who is not attached to staying in office can make the difficult decisions that actually serve their constituents' long-term interests. The artist who is not attached to critical approval can create work that genuinely expresses their vision rather than pandering to external expectations. The parent who is not attached to being liked can provide the guidance and boundaries their children actually need for healthy development. The weak self seeks to control others as a way of managing its own insecurity, but this approach inevitably fails because it places one's peace of mind at the mercy of forces beyond direct control. The strong self recognizes that the only thing truly under one's control is one's own response to circumstances, and focuses its energy on optimizing that response rather than trying to manipulate external variables. As Giovanni's business empire grew, he noticed something remarkable: his competitors, who were still operating from attachment and emotional investment, had become predictable to him. He could anticipate their moves because their moves were driven by psychological needs rather than strategic logic. They would hold on to losing positions too long because admitting a mistake threatened their self-image. They would pursue deals that flattered their ego rather than served their financial interests. They would react to his moves emotionally rather than responding strategically, giving him multiple opportunities to outmaneuver them. The destruction of the weak self is not a one-time event but an ongoing process of conscious evolution. Each situation presents new opportunities to choose between the comfortable patterns of weakness and the more challenging path of strategic clarity. The merchant, the politician, the artist, the parent all face daily decisions about whether to act from attachment or from detachment, from ego or from strategy, from fear or from strength. Machiavelli understood that this internal battle is the most important war any leader will ever fight, because victory in this inner realm translates directly into effectiveness in all external endeavors. The man who has destroyed his weak self, who has systematically eliminated his dependencies on external validation, his attachments to specific outcomes, and his emotional reactions to temporary setbacks, becomes truly invulnerable to the manipulations and pressures that easily defeat those who remain slaves to their own psychology. Part 2. The strategic mind unbound. The rain fell steadily on the red tile roofs of Florence as Machiavelli walked through the empty streets, his mind turning over the observations that would reshape political thought for centuries to come. In the distance, the bells of Santa Croce tolled midnight, and, in that sound he heard both an ending and a beginning, the death of naive idealism and the birth of strategic realism. The weak self, he had come to understand, operated from a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of power itself. Power, as conceived by the weak self, is a finite resource to be hoarded, protected, and jealously guarded. It views every interaction as a zero-sum game where one person's gain necessarily means another's loss. This perspective creates a defensive, reactive mindset that paradoxically weakens one's actual position by making it rigid and predictable. The strategic mind, liberated from such limitations, recognizes that true power is generative. It creates value, opens possibilities, and expands the total amount of influence available within any system. Consider the transformation of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, who would later become Pope Leo X, as he learned to distinguish between the appearance of power and its substance. In his early years as a church politician, he had operated like most of his peers, accumulating titles, seeking prestigious appointments, and building networks based on mutual obligation and fear. These efforts brought him a certain degree of influence, but they also made him predictable and vulnerable to anyone who could offer his allies better terms or more compelling threats. The shift began when Giovanni realized that his attachment to maintaining his current position was actually limiting his ability to achieve his larger objectives. He was so focused on protecting what he had that he couldn't see opportunities for quantum leaps in influence and effectiveness. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging period when rival factions within the church were maneuvering to marginalize his family's influence. Instead of responding defensively, Giovanni chose to step back from the immediate conflict and examine the entire system from a detached perspective. What he discovered was that the very structure of church politics, with its emphasis on hereditary influence and traditional alliances, was becoming obsolete in the face of changing social and economic realities. Rather than fighting harder within the existing system, Giovanni began to position himself as a bridge between the old order and the emerging new paradigms. This required him to sacrifice some short-term advantages and risk some immediate criticism, but it ultimately placed him at the center of transformative changes that his more traditionally minded rivals couldn't even see coming. The strategic mind operates from what Machiavelli termed elevated perspective, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that remain invisible to those trapped in reactive thinking. This elevation is not merely intellectual but psychological, requiring a fundamental shift in how one relates to circumstances and outcomes. The weak self experiences setbacks as personal failures and successes as validation of its worth. The strategic mind views both as information to be processed and integrated into an ever-evolving understanding of the terrain. This transformation in perspective creates what appears to others as an almost supernatural ability to anticipate and respond to changing circumstances. Giovanni found that as he became less emotionally invested in defending his current position, he became much more sensitive to subtle shifts in the political landscape. He could sense when alliances were weakening before the participants themselves recognized it. He could identify emerging opportunities that others missed because they were focused on protecting existing advantages. The key to this enhanced perception lay in what Giovanni came to call strategic emptiness, a state of mental and emotional availability that allowed him to respond to situations based on their actual characteristics rather than his preconceived notions about how they should unfold. This emptiness was not passivity but rather a form of dynamic readiness, like a master swordsman who holds his blade in perfect balance, prepared to move in any direction as the moment requires. The practical applications of this mindset extended far beyond personal advancement into the realm of systemic influence. Giovanni discovered that by positioning himself as someone who was genuinely committed to optimal outcomes rather than personal gain, he attracted allies and information that would never have been available to him when he was operating from a more self-interested perspective. People trusted him with sensitive intelligence because they could see that he would use it wisely rather than opportunistically. This trustworthiness was not based on moral righteousness but on strategic reliability. Giovanni had demonstrated that his decision-making process was based on clear principles and long-term thinking rather than emotional reactions or short-term advantage. This consistency made him valuable to others as an ally and formidable to others as an opponent, because his responses could be anticipated in general terms while remaining unpredictable in their specific implementation. The strategic mind also recognizes that influence operates through multiple dimensions simultaneously. While others might focus on direct confrontation or obvious forms of pressure, the detached leader understands that the most effective interventions often occur in areas that seem peripheral to the immediate conflict. Giovanni learned to influence outcomes by changing the context within which decisions were made, rather than trying to control the decisions themselves. For example, when facing opposition to a particular policy initiative, rather than engaging in direct argumentation with his opponents, Giovanni would quietly work to shift the broader conversation in ways that made his preferred outcome seem like the obvious choice. He might introduce new information that reframed the entire issue, or create circumstances that made alternative approaches impractical, or simply wait for external events to demonstrate the wisdom of his position. This indirect approach required a level of patience and strategic thinking that the weak self finds almost impossible to maintain. The weak self wants immediate validation and clear victories that can be easily recognized and celebrated. The strategic mind, however, understands that the most lasting victories are often invisible to outside observers, embedded in structural changes that continue to generate advantages long after the initial intervention is forgotten. The transformation from reactive to strategic thinking also creates a fundamental shift in how one understands and uses information. The weak self hoards information as a source of personal power, revealing it only when doing so provides immediate advantage. The strategic mind recognizes that information becomes more powerful when it flows freely, creating networks of understanding and influence that serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Giovanni developed a practice of what he called intelligent transparency, sharing information and insights in ways that enhanced his reputation for wisdom and judgment while also building networks of reciprocal intelligence gathering. He would often give away valuable information to demonstrate his trustworthiness and his commitment to optimal outcomes, knowing that this generosity would return to him multiplied through enhanced access to other people's knowledge and perspectives. This approach required a fundamental shift in his relationship to scarcity and abundance. The weak self operates from fear that there isn't enough, not enough recognition, not enough opportunity, not enough security. This scarcity mindset creates defensive behaviors that actually limit one's access to resources and opportunities. The strategic mind operates from an abundance perspective, recognizing that value is created through intelligent combination and recombination of existing elements rather than through hoarding and protection. The practical implications of this shift were dramatic. As Giovanni became known for his generous sharing of insights and opportunities, he found himself at the center of multiple networks of information and influence. People would bring him opportunities first, not because he paid the best prices or offered the most attractive terms, but because they trusted his judgment and knew that working with him would likely lead to additional opportunities down the line. This network effect created a form of compound growth in his influence that would have been impossible to achieve through direct accumulation of traditional forms of power. Each relationship enhanced the value of every other relationship, each piece of information became more valuable when combined with other pieces, and each success created platforms for even greater successes. The strategic mind also understands that timing is often more important than force. The weak self tends to push hard when it encounters resistance, believing that persistence and effort will eventually overcome obstacles. The strategic mind recognizes that resistance often indicates poor timing rather than insufficient force, and learns to work with natural rhythms and cycles rather than against them. Giovanni became a master of what he termed patient positioning, placing himself and his resources in locations where they would be most valuable when circumstances shifted in predictable ways. This required him to think in longer time horizons than his competitors and to make investments that might not pay off for years. But, when those payoffs came, they often came with compound interest that far exceeded what could have been achieved through more immediate approaches. The culmination of this strategic development was Giovanni's recognition that true invulnerability comes not from defensive strength but from adaptive capacity. The weak self seeks to build walls high enough and thick enough to protect against all possible threats. The strategic mind seeks to develop the flexibility and responsiveness to thrive under any circumstances, viewing challenges as opportunities to demonstrate its adaptability rather than threats to be defended against. This adaptive capacity became Giovanni's greatest source of strength as he navigated the complex political transformations of his era. While others were weakened by changes that undermined their traditional bases of power, he was able to reinvent himself repeatedly, always finding ways to add value within new paradigms and systems. His security came not from any particular position or resource, but from his demonstrated ability to create value under changing circumstances. The strategic mind, fully developed, becomes a force of nature not because it dominates through raw power, but because it harmonizes so completely with the underlying patterns of reality that resistance becomes futile. Like water finding its way through any terrain, the strategic mind flows around obstacles, fills available spaces, and gradually reshapes the landscape through patient, persistent pressure applied in precisely the right places at precisely the right times. Part 3, The Invulnerable Self. The years had passed like shadows across the marble floors of power, and, in a quiet chamber overlooking the Arno River, an old man sat reviewing the manuscripts that would outlive empires. Machiavelli's hands, now marked by age and countless hours of writing, held the final pages of his most profound insight, that the destruction of one's weak self is not an end in itself, but the beginning of something far more magnificent, the birth of an invulnerable consciousness that operates beyond the reach of external manipulation or internal sabotage. The invulnerable self is not built through accumulating defenses or eliminating risks, but through achieving such complete internal integration that external circumstances lose their power to disturb one's fundamental equilibrium. This state represents the ultimate expression of Machiavelli's paradox. By caring deeply about outcomes while remaining completely detached from them, one achieves a form of strategic invincibility that operates across all domains of human endeavor. The merchant Giovanni, now in his later years and, having built an empire that spanned continents, embodied this principle in ways that continued to astonish those who observed him closely. During a particularly challenging period when political upheavals threatened to destroy much of what he had built, Giovanni's response demonstrated the full flowering of strategic consciousness. Rather than desperately attempting to preserve existing structures, he systematically dismantled those portions of his empire that were vulnerable to the changing political climate, simultaneously investing the freed resources in new opportunities that the chaos itself was creating. This response required a level of detachment that appeared almost superhuman to his contemporaries. Giovanni was able to destroy significant portions of his life's work without emotional trauma because he had learned to identify completely with the process of creation rather than with any particular creation. His security came not from what he owned or controlled, but from his demonstrated capacity to generate value under any circumstances. The external changes that devastated his competitors became opportunities for him to demonstrate this generative capacity in new and more sophisticated ways. The invulnerable self operates from what can only be described as a different relationship to existence itself. Where the weak self seeks permanence and security through accumulating resources and building defenses, the invulnerable self finds security through embracing impermanence and developing the capacity to thrive within constant change. This shift represents a fundamental evolution in consciousness, from a survival-based mentality to a growth-based mentality, from scarcity thinking to abundance thinking, from reactive patterns to creative responses. Consider the case of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, who became legendary for her ability to navigate the treacherous political waters of Renaissance Italy while maintaining her independence and influence across multiple decades of dramatic change. Her invulnerability did not come from military strength or vast wealth, but from her ability to continuously recreate herself in response to changing circumstances while never losing her essential character and values. Isabella understood that true strength lies not in rigidity but in what she called principled flexibility, the ability to adapt one's strategies and tactics to changing circumstances while remaining anchored to core values and long-term objectives. This approach allowed her to form alliances with former enemies when circumstances changed, to abandon previously successful strategies when they became obsolete, and to take positions that appeared contradictory on the surface but served consistent deeper purposes. The development of such principled flexibility requires a sophisticated understanding of the difference between one's essential self and one's situational roles. The weak self confuses identity with circumstances, becoming psychologically dependent on maintaining particular positions, relationships, or achievements. The invulnerable self recognizes that all external forms are temporary and finds its true identity in the consciousness that remains constant through all changes. This distinction allows for what Machiavelli observed as the ultimate political skill, the ability to play multiple games simultaneously while being captured by none of them. Isabella could engage fully in courtly politics, international diplomacy, military strategy, artistic patronage, and commercial ventures without her success or failure in any one arena affecting her fundamental sense of self or her effectiveness in the others. The practical implications of this internal organization are profound. When one's identity is not dependent on external validation or achievement, one becomes capable of taking risks that would paralyze others. Isabella could support causes that might fail, invest in ventures that might collapse, and form alliances that might prove temporary, because her sense of worth and security was not tied to the success of any particular initiative. This freedom from outcome dependency creates what appears to others as an almost magical ability to influence events. Because Isabella was not desperate for any particular result, she could pursue multiple approaches simultaneously, abandoning those that weren't working and doubling down on those that showed promise. Her competitors, who were usually committed to single strategies because their egos were invested in being proven right, couldn't match this adaptive versatility. The invulnerable self also develops what can only be described as a different relationship to time itself. While the weak self is constantly either mourning the past or anxious about the future, the invulnerable self operates from a deep presence that allows it to perceive and respond to the subtle currents of the eternal now. This presence creates access to information and opportunities that are invisible to minds caught in temporal displacement. Isabella cultivated this presence through what she called strategic meditation, periods of complete withdrawal from active engagement during which she would allow her mind to process and integrate all the information and experiences she had accumulated. These periods were not passive rest but active intelligence gathering at the deepest level, allowing patterns and possibilities to emerge that could not be perceived through analytical thinking alone. During one such period of strategic withdrawal, Isabella gained the insight that would define the next phase of her political evolution. She realized that the traditional model of power through control was becoming obsolete in an increasingly interconnected world, and that future influence would belong to those who could facilitate and enhance the success of others rather than dominating them directly. This insight led to a fundamental transformation in her approach to leadership. Rather than seeking to control outcomes through direct manipulation, Isabella began positioning herself as what she termed a strategic catalyst, someone whose presence and participation enhanced the effectiveness of any group or endeavor she joined. This role required her to develop capacities that went far beyond traditional political skills. She learned to read group dynamics with extraordinary precision, identifying the subtle tensions and unexpressed needs that were limiting collective effectiveness. She developed the ability to ask questions that helped others clarify their own thinking and discover solutions they already possessed but hadn't yet accessed. Most importantly, she cultivated the patience to allow others to receive credit for successes while she focused on the satisfaction of having contributed to optimal outcomes. This catalytic approach created a form of influence that was nearly impossible to resist or undermine. Because Isabella was genuinely committed to the success of others rather than her own advancement, people sought her involvement in their most important initiatives. Her reputation for enhancing whatever she touched meant that her participation became a mark of credibility and a predictor of success. The strategic implications of this approach extended far beyond personal advancement into the realm of systemic transformation. As Isabella became known for her ability to facilitate success in others, she found herself at the center of networks of influence that spanned traditional boundaries of politics, commerce, arts, and religion. These networks were not based on hierarchical control but on voluntary association among people who had experienced the benefits of working with someone committed to optimal outcomes rather than personal advantage. The invulnerable self, fully developed, becomes a force for systemic evolution rather than merely personal success. Because it operates from abundance rather than scarcity, from creation rather than competition, from service rather than exploitation, it naturally attracts resources and opportunities while simultaneously generating value for others. This creates what can only be described as an upward spiral of influence and effectiveness that continues to expand without apparent limits. Isabella's later years demonstrated this principle in action. As her reputation for strategic wisdom and collaborative effectiveness spread beyond Italy's borders, she became an unofficial advisor to rulers and leaders across Europe. Her influence operated through invitation rather than imposition, through enhancement rather than replacement, through evolution rather than revolution. She had become what Machiavelli recognized as the highest form of political being, someone whose very presence elevated the quality of thinking and decision-making in any context. The development of such influence represents the ultimate resolution of Machiavelli's paradox. By completely destroying the weak self with its dependencies and attachments, Isabella had discovered a form of strength that was literally invulnerable to external attack. Because her security came from her capacity to generate value rather than from any particular possession or position, there was nothing that others could threaten or take away that would diminish her essential effectiveness. More profoundly, because her influence operated through enhancement rather than domination, attacking her would be counterproductive for anyone seeking to advance their own interests. She had positioned herself so that her success was synonymous with the success of those around her, making her practically invulnerable to the jealousy and competition that typically limit the influence of powerful individuals. The invulnerable self represents not just a strategic achievement but an evolutionary leap in human consciousness. It demonstrates that it is possible to operate in the world of power and influence while remaining completely free from the psychological and spiritual corruption that such engagement typically entails. More than that, it shows that the highest levels of effectiveness are only achievable when one has transcended the ego-based motivations that drive most human activity. As Machiavelli concluded in his final notes, the man who destroys his weak self does indeed become invulnerable to destruction by others, but not in the way that most people imagine. The invulnerability comes not from superior defenses or overwhelming force, but from having evolved beyond the psychological structures that make one vulnerable in the first place. When one no longer needs external validation, cannot be threatened with loss of position or possessions, and finds meaning in the process of creation rather than in any particular creation, one has indeed stepped outside the game while simultaneously gaining the ability to influence its outcome. This is the ultimate expression of strategic consciousness, the recognition that true power comes not from controlling others or even controlling circumstances, but from achieving such complete mastery over oneself that control becomes irrelevant. The invulnerable self operates from a dimension of being where influence flows naturally from authenticity, where effectiveness emerges from alignment with deeper principles, and where security comes from the demonstrated capacity to create value under any conceivable circumstances. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not about political manipulation or strategic deception, but about human potential itself. He saw that within each person lies the capacity to evolve beyond the limitations of ordinary consciousness into something far more powerful and beneficial, not just for oneself, but for everyone whose lives one touches. The destruction of the weak self is not an end but a beginning, not a loss but a liberation, not a death but a birth into forms of effectiveness and influence that operate beyond the reach of ordinary human limitation. The document closes with this understanding, that the path to invulnerability is simultaneously the path to service, that the destruction of weakness is simultaneously the creation of strength, and that the detachment from outcomes is simultaneously the achievement of optimal results. These paradoxes are not contradictions to be resolved but truths to be embodied, not problems to be solved but realities to be lived. In their embodiment lies the secret of power that serves not just the individual who wields it, but the larger evolution of human consciousness itself. Thus ends the exploration of Machiavelli's ultimate paradox, that in destroying what is weak within us, we discover what is truly invincible, that in detaching from the game, we gain the power to shape its rules, and that in serving something greater than ourselves, we achieve a form of greatness that no external force can diminish or destroy.